A rag. Master Chief Dane Ashford smirked at her uniform. Nobody told me they were letting the interns sit in on operational briefs. The room laughed. Reyna Voss said nothing. Opened her folder, didn't look up. Then the door opened. A 4-star general walked in. Every operator shot to attention. And General Marcus Whitfield, a man who had briefed 3 presidents, looked past 11 decorated SEALs straight at the small woman still sitting down. He bowed his head. "Good to see you again, Commander Voss." Silence detonated across the room, because the intern they'd just mocked outranked every man standing there. Because she was the daughter of a legendary OP who vanished 18 years ago on a mission the government swore never happened. And because hidden inside her next assignment was a symbol only her father ever carved scratched into a beam inside enemy territory. He was supposed to be dead, so why was his signature still bleeding through the walls of war? 6:40 in the morning, and the range belonged to her alone. Fog off the water, salt in her teeth, the particular gray that swallowed the tree line 30 yards out and shrank the whole world down to something small enough to hold in 2 hands, which was, Reyna Voss had come to understand over 29 years of mornings, exactly like this one, the only size the world had ever really needed to be. She breathed in, held it, let it go on a 4 count the way her father had taught her before she was old enough to spell the word ballistics, before she understood that some lessons came wrapped in love and arrived anyway looking like discipline. The rifle didn't move, because that was the whole trick. Not the eye, not even the trigger, not really. The stillness, the absence of anything you could call a heartbeat until the exact half-second between beats, when the entire world went quiet and let you through it, clean. The way water let a stone through if the stone knew how to fall correctly. She fired. Steel rang 400 yards downrange. A flat, clean note, gone almost before it finished being a sound at all. She didn't smile. She never smiled at 400 yards. Smiling was for people who still had something to prove to the target, and she had stopped needing that a long time ago, somewhere around the 3rd deployment, somewhere around the point where proving things to steel plates had stopped mattering, and proving things to the people standing behind her had started mattering instead, which was its own kind of trap, though she hadn't fully worked that part out yet, might never work it out. Some things you just carried, what she needed, what she still needed, even now, even at 29 with silver oak leaves sitting in a velvet box on her dresser and a command flag folded in a drawer with her name stenciled beneath a unit designation that officially did not exist. She needed the quiet before the shot more than she needed the shot itself, which was probably a problem, which was probably something a Navy psychologist somewhere would circle in red ink if she ever let one get close enough to look. But she wasn't going to let one get close enough to look. Not today. Not with a 9 a.m. briefing that had already rearranged itself once, and felt in the marrow of her like it was about to try to eat her alive. She broke down the rifle without being told to, cleaned it without needing to. Her hands did this, the way other people's hands buttoned a shirt thoughtless, automatic, a language older than speech, older than grief, older than the 11-year-old girl who still lived somewhere behind her ribs and occasionally, without warning, still asked questions nobody had ever properly answered. Her phone buzzed against the range bench, the sound obscene in all that quiet briefing, moved up 900 sharp, Conf Room 4, LL for Lindqvist, her ops chief, 2 words that meant nothing on their own, and 1 number that meant everything. Because Conference Room 4 wasn't for routine anything. Conference Room 4 was where the building put you when it wanted witnesses, when it wanted a room big enough to hold whatever was coming and small enough that nobody inside it could pretend later they hadn't seen it happen. She looked at the fog a moment longer. Somewhere under all that gray, 400 yards out, a steel plate was still ringing faintly, like a bell somebody forgot to stop. She packed her gear and did not look back at the water again, because looking back at the water was a thing she allowed herself exactly once per session, and she had already spent it, the way she spent everything carefully, on purpose, with the specific rationed discipline of a person who had learned very young that the world did not hand out unlimited quantities of anything that mattered. The drive back to the base took 11 minutes, and she used every one of them the way her father had taught her to use transit time, which was not to relax, because relaxing was a luxury item she'd priced out of her budget years ago, but to run the day forward before the day arrived, so that nothing that happened inside it could arrive as a genuine surprise. Holloway Ridge, 3 hostages. A compound with 2 visible perimeter rings and analyst notes that read, in the flat bureaucratic language analysts used when they wanted to flag something without committing to an opinion. Insufficient overhead coverage on tertiary structures. Recommend additional pass prior to execution. She'd read that line 4 times the night before. Insufficient overhead coverage. 4 words that meant, translated out of the careful hedge language of people who didn't want to be wrong on the record, we don't actually know what's back there, and we're telling you that in the smallest font we're allowed to use. She didn't like small fonts. Small fonts got people killed. The base gate waved her through on recognition, the young petty officer at the checkpoint offering the specific nod that Kestrel personnel got not quite deference, because most of the base had no idea Kestrel personnel existed, but something adjacent to it, an unconscious registering of don't ask questions about this one that filtered down through shall nobody ever explained out loud. She parked, sat in the car a moment longer than strictly necessary, because there was a particular kind of morning rare, but not rare enough, when the fog off the water followed her all the way to the parking lot, settled somewhere behind her sternum, and refused to burn off the way ordinary fog did. This was one of those mornings. Had been, if she was honest with herself, since roughly 4:30 a.m., when she'd woken from a dream she couldn't fully remember, except for the specific useless detail that it had involved gravel under tires, and a sound she'd spent 18 years trying not to recognize. She got out of the car, squared her shoulders, went inside. The building smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax, the particular combination that meant somebody important was coming. And the custodial staff had been told twice, possibly 3 times. Possibly by someone whose voice didn't invite a second explanation. Reyna walked the corridor in her service uniform. Not the standard issue every other officer in this building wore, pressed and predictable and government issue grey-blue, but the modified working rig that came with Task Force Kestrel, and nobody else. Darker fabric, cut close, built for movement instead of ceremony. No unit patch, because Kestrel didn't officially exist, and things that didn't exist didn't get patches, didn't get ribbons, didn't get the small comforting symbols that told a room at a glance who you were and what you'd earned the right to wear. Just her name tape, Voss, and beneath it, small gray, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, and impossible to misread if you were, a tab that told anyone who knew how to read tabs that she outranked most of the people in this building and answered, in any meaningful operational sense, to almost nobody in it. Almost nobody read gray tabs anymore. That was the whole problem with almost nobody. It left just enough room for exactly the kind of morning she was about to have. She could hear the room before she reached the door. That particular baritone hum of men who'd spent decades being the loudest voice in every space they occupied, and had never once had cause to lower it, because volume had worked for them before, and things that worked had a way of getting used again and again, until somebody finally made them stop. She stopped outside conference room 4, squared her shoulders again, though they were already square, because sometimes the body needed the instruction twice before it believed it, because that's what you did before a room like this one. Doubt was for the range, not the hallway. She'd already spent her doubt, too, same as the water, same as the look back, and there wasn't any more of it left in the budget for this particular morning. She opened the door. 12 heads turned. 11 of them turned back to their coffee, within a second and a half, unbothered, because a small woman in an unfamiliar uniform, walking into a room full of operators registered, to the untrained or simply uninterested eye, exactly the way a housekeeping staffer registered. Background noise. Furniture that happened to move on its own. The 12th head didn't turn back. Master Chief Dane Ashford had the kind of face that had been rebuilt by weather and violence in roughly equal measure jaw, like a cinder block, a scar through one eyebrow that made him look permanently skeptical, even in the rare moments he wasn't trying to. 22 years in naval special warfare. 11 deployments nobody outside a 6-digit clearance would ever hear the details of. The kind of resume that made rooms go quiet when he walked into them, because rooms had learned, the way animals learned weather, that men who carried resumes like his had also usually carried something heavier out of every single one of those deployments, and heavy men required a certain amount of careful handling. He looked at her uniform first, then her face, then her uniform again, like the first look might have been a mistake he wanted a second chance to correct. "You lost, honey." Somebody at the back of the room laughed, short, ugly, the kind of laugh that existed for no reason, except to agree with somebody more powerful than itself. The social physics of a room where laughter followed status the same reliable way water followed gravity. Reyna didn't answer right away, because answering right away would have meant she needed to, and she didn't need to. She walked to the third chair, from the head of the table her chair, the one with her folder already sitting on it, because Lindqvist had set it there 20 minutes earlier, quiet and efficient and entirely without fanfare, the way he did everything, and she sat. Ashford's eyes followed her the whole way down, tracked her like she was a target he hadn't decided yet whether to classify as a threat or a joke, and clearly leaning, in that particular moment, toward the second option. That a joke. He tipped his chin at her uniform. Not a Navy working uniform, not a flight suit, not anything anybody in this room had a name for. Just dark fabric, a name tape, a tab. Most of them had never learned to read and had certainly never bothered to ask about. They let civvies sit in on these now. Or is this some kind of contractor thing? You a contractor? No, one word. Flat. She opened her folder and didn't look up, because looking up would have handed him something to work with, and she had learned a long time ago, on a lake, from a man who never once raised his voice to win an argument, that the fastest way to end a fight nobody needed to be having was to refuse to supply the other side with fuel. Ashford wasn't finished. Men like Ashford were rarely finished after one word, because one word had never once stopped them before, and 22 years of nobody stopping them had taught them, without anyone meaning to teach it, that words like hers were rhetorical courtesies, rather than actual answers, small pleasantries you were supposed to work your way politely around. "So, what is that?" He gestured, open palm, at the whole of her, top to bottom, the way you'd gesture at a stray dog that had wandered uninvited into a mess hall and was somehow still standing there, like it belonged. "Some kind of I don't know. Support staff uniform? They give y'all a whole different look now?" "It's mine, it's a rag." He said it easy, almost kind, in the specific way cruelty sometimes dressed itself up as friendliness, so that if you objected, you were somehow the one who'd misread the room, the one being difficult, the one who couldn't take a joke. "No offense. Just nobody told me they were letting the interns sit in on operational briefs these days." The laugh came again, wider this time, 3 or 4 voices joining the first one, because that was how rooms worked, how they had always worked, laughter finding its own gravity and pulling more of itself in, the way a landslide gathered speed simply because gravity had already agreed to help it. Reyna turned a page in her folder. She did not look up, because in this was the part that would have surprised Ashford, would have surprised every man in that room, if a single one of them had bothered to actually look at her, instead of merely through her. She'd heard worse. She'd heard worse from men twice his rank and half his talent. She'd heard it from instructors who seemed to believe a 5'3" woman carrying her father's last name owed them a formal apology just for showing up to selection. She'd heard it in briefing rooms in 3 different states, and once, memorably, in a language that wasn't English, from a colonel who hadn't expected her to understand a word of it and had spent the rest of that deployment carefully avoiding her eyes. Every one of those rooms had gone quiet eventually. Every single one. Not because she'd argued. Arguing was for people who needed the room's agreement before they could function, and she had never needed that. Not once. Not since she was 11 years old and learned, on a range beside a lake, nobody could find on a map without careful directions, that the only argument that mattered was the one you made, with your hands and your eyes, and the 4-count breath sitting in the gap between heartbeats. Everything else, the noise, the laughter, The men who mistook loud for right, who mistook confident for correct. That was just weather. You didn't argue with weather. You waited it out. The way her father had waited out storms on that same lake. Patient, unbothered, certain the sky would eventually run out of things to say. Ashford leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, warming to the audience now the way performers did when they sensed the room enjoying them. I'm just saying, we got a live op in about 4 hours, and command sends us. He flicked 2 fingers at her, dismissive, already halfway bored with his own joke, whatever this is. No offense, sweetheart, but if you're lost, the front desk's back that way, sweetheart. Somewhere in the back of her skull, quiet and cold, a version of Reyna that only existed in the half-second before a shot noted the word, filed it, and moved on without further comment, because that version of her didn't waste ammunition on things that didn't matter yet, and this didn't matter yet. Not enough. Not compared to what was coming. She closed her folder, set both hands flat on the table, and she looked up finally properly, for the first time since walking in with an expression that carried absolutely nothing for him to grab onto. No anger, no hurt, no fuel for the next line, whatever it was going to be. Just stillness. The same stillness she used at 400 yards, the exact temperature of a range at dawn. Master Chief. Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. Rising was, for people who thought volume was the same thing as authority, and volume had never once, in 29 years, been the thing that got her what she needed. I'd sit down if I were you. Is that right? He grinned, and it was almost charming, in the way that certain predators were sometimes almost charming right up until you understood exactly what they were and what they'd been building toward the entire time. And why's that, sweetheart? The door opened. Every head in the room turned this time, all 12, because the sound that came through that door wasn't a knock and wasn't a shuffle. It was the specific, unmistakable cadence of someone who had spent 40 years learning exactly how much space to occupy when entering a room, and had never once, in any of those 40 years, needed to ask permission for a single square inch of it. 4 stars. Silver hair cropped close, a jaw that had outlasted 3 wars and roughly a dozen administrations. General Marcus Whitfield didn't announce himself. He never had to. The room announced him instead. 12 bodies snapping up out of their chairs so fast that one man's coffee went over. Dark liquid pooling unheeded on the table, because nobody in that room, not even Ashford, was thinking about coffee anymore, was thinking about anything, except the sudden, overwhelming physics of a 4-star general walking unannounced into a room that had, 90 seconds earlier, felt like it belonged entirely to somebody else. At ease, Whitfield said, in a voice that somehow made at ease sound like the least at ease thing anyone had said all morning. He surveyed the room, 12 operators standing at rigid, silent attention, coffee dripping, unheeded, toward the edge of the table, and one small woman in a dark uniform still sitting. Whitfield's eyes found her, and something happened to his face that none of the 12 men standing in that room had ever, in any of their combined careers, witnessed happen to General Marcus Whitfield's face before. It softened, Commander. Reyna stood, not fast, not nervous. The unhurried, economical movement of someone who had never once, in her professional life, needed to rush for anybody, because rushing suggested you'd been caught off guard, and she made a point of never, under any circumstances, allowing herself to look caught off guard in front of a room. General. And then General Marcus Whitfield, 4 stars, 41 years of service, a man who had briefed 3 presidents and buried more friends than most people in this room had ever met in their entire lives, inclined his head. To her, an actual bow of the neck, brief and formal and utterly unmistakable, the kind of gesture reserved for people whose authority didn't require explanation because the room simply understood it the moment they saw it happen. The way you understood weather, without needing a meteorologist to confirm it was raining. Good to see you again, Commander Voss. Silence. The particular silence that follows a sound so wrong the room needs a full 3 seconds just to process that it actually happened, that it wasn't a mishearing, that the ground really had just moved. Ashford's mouth was still open from whatever word he'd been about to say. It stayed open. Nothing came out of it. Nothing at all. General. Reyna's voice hadn't changed at all. Same flat, even calm she'd used on Ashford 30 seconds earlier, as though the man who ranked highest in the entire building and the man who'd just called her a rag both merited precisely the same amount of her volume. We weren't expecting you until 1100. Change of plans. Whitfield's eyes swept the room once, slow, like a lighthouse beam, finding every ship in the harbor and cataloguing them one by one, filing away who stood where and what their faces did in the moment they realized the ground had shifted. Given the scope of what we're about to discuss, I decided the briefing needed a different tone from the top. A pause, precisely timed. The pause of a man who'd spent a career understanding exactly how much silence a sentence needed before it landed properly. Seems I got here just in time. He looked at Ashford. Master Chief Dane Ashford, 22 years, 11 deployments. A resume that could silence rooms on its own, stood there with coffee dripping unnoticed off the edge of the table onto his boot, and said absolutely nothing at all. Master Chief. Whitfield's tone hadn't sharpened. It didn't need to. I trust you've met Commander Voss. Sir. Ashford's jaw worked, found nothing. Tried again, slower. We hadn't been introduced, formally. No. Whitfield's gaze didn't move off him. I gathered that. Nobody breathed. Commander Voss. Whitfield continued, and now his voice carried, easy and clear, meant for every ear in the room. Commands Task Force Kestrel. As of 0600 this morning, Kestrel has operational authority over the Holloway Ridge tasking, which means, gentlemen, and here he did smile, thin and brief, more warning than warmth, the smile of a man who had learned exactly how much smile a threat required. She outranks every man standing in this room for the duration of this mission, including me, for the parts of it that fall inside her lane. Somebody's chair creaked. Nobody moved to sit in it, sir. Ashford's voice came out lower than before. Careful now, in the specific way men got careful after realizing the ground had shifted under them without their permission or their knowledge. With respect, nobody read us in on that. You're being read in right now. Whitfield's eyes finally left Ashford and came back to Reyna. Something passed between the two of them, brief, unreadable to anyone else at the table. The specific kind of look that belonged to people who shared history nobody else in the room had ever been given access to, and probably never would be. Commander, the floor's yours. And just like that, without another word, General Marcus Whitfield, 4 stars, a man who had never once in living memory deferred to anyone under the rank of admiral, took a seat at the far end of the table and waited for her. Reyna stood at the head of the table, now the space Whitfield had left for her without asking, and opened her folder to the first page like nothing at all had happened in the last 90 seconds. Like the entire architecture of the room hadn't just been quietly, permanently rearranged in front of 12 witnesses who would carry the memory of it for the rest of their careers, if telling it at bars and reunions for decades. The story of the morning a general bowed to a woman in a uniform they'd called a rag. Sit down, Master Chief. Ashford sat, because there was at that particular moment absolutely nothing else left for him to do. She ran the brief clean, no wasted words, no wasted breath. The particular economy of a person who had learned, somewhere along the way, that every extra sentence in a briefing was a sentence somebody might mishear at the exact wrong moment, in the exact wrong place, at the exact wrong volume, and that mistakes born of imprecise language had a way of costing more than mistakes born of almost anything else. Holloway Ridge, the name meant nothing to anyone in the room, and that was intentional, because names that meant something got remembered, and this operation needed to be forgotten the moment it ended, folded away into the same drawer that held every other operation Kestrel had ever run and never once discussed outside a room exactly like this one. A compound 11 miles outside a mid-sized city, whose name she didn't say either, occupied by a network that called itself something with teeth in it, Vulture, in the internal paperwork, though nobody used that word out loud in briefings, because words like that had a way of making men feel like they were living inside a movie instead of doing a job that had real, permanent, unglamorous consequences for real people. 3 hostages, American nationals, tied to a federal contractor whose specifics didn't matter to anyone in this room and wouldn't matter to the after-action summary that would eventually get filed and forgotten. A compound with 2 visible perimeter rings, and this was the part that made Ashford sit forward, made even Whitfield's eyes narrow slightly. At the far end of the table, evidence, thin but real, of a 3rd ring that hadn't shown up on any satellite pass in the previous 6 weeks. Which means, Reyna said, tapping the projected image without raising her voice, either their construction crew is remarkably fast, or somebody's feeding them intelligence about our overhead windows, and I don't love either option for what it's worth. You're saying somebody's dirty, Ashford said. Not a question anymore. His voice had lost the mockery completely now, replaced by the flat, focused tone of a professional who'd just been handed a problem worth actually taking seriously, and who understood, in the way professionals understood these things, that the time for jokes had quietly ended somewhere in the last 3 minutes. I'm saying I don't rule it out. Reyna clicked to the next slide, which is why this stays inside this room until execution. No secondary briefings, no read-ins beyond what's already sitting at this table. That include command? Someone asked from the back, a younger operator, sandy-haired, the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to keep its skepticism entirely off it, the way older operators eventually learned, through repetition and consequence, to keep almost everything off their faces. That includes everyone who isn't currently sitting at this table, Reyna said, including the general. Whitfield from the far end didn't so much as blink, agreed. Ashford looked between the 2 of them, the 4-star who'd just voluntarily surrendered his own information privilege to a woman half his age, and by the numbers everyone in the room actually understood, less than half his rank seniority, and something in his weathered face shifted. Not respect yet. Respect took longer than 90 seconds, even for a man who just watched the ground move twice in the same morning. But something, a recalculation, the particular expression of a man quietly updating a file he'd been careless enough, 20 minutes earlier, to believe was already finished and closed. She walked them through the entry plan. 2 elements, staggered timing, a bird on standby that existed only as a line item nobody in the room would ever see fly, its existence confirmed only in the specific gray language of budget documents nobody outside 3 offices would ever read. She didn't raise her voice once, didn't need visual aids beyond the 3 slides she'd already shown, because she'd built the plan, the way her father had built plans, spare, load-bearing, nothing decorative. Every piece doing exactly one job and doing it exactly once. No ornamentation, no flourish, nothing added simply because it looked impressive on paper. Questions, nobody had any, which, from a room like this, full of men who ordinarily had opinions about everything, was its own kind of answer, and everyone at the table understood exactly what kind. Then we're done here. She closed the folder. Wheels up at 14:30. Full mission brief and equipment check at 1300. Master Chief, and here, for the first time since she'd walked into the room, something flickered behind her flat, even expression, something that might have been the smallest, coolest edge of satisfaction, though she'd have denied it if anyone had asked. I'll need your element's readiness report by noon. Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, not sweetheart, not honey. The 2 syllables came out of him, like they'd cost him something real. And maybe they had, and Reyna decided with the same economy she decided everything that she didn't particularly care what it had cost him, only that it had been paid, and paid in front of witnesses. The room emptied in stages, operators peeling off toward the equipment cages, toward phones, toward the particular pre-mission silence that settled over professionals who understood exactly what the next 8 hours were going to demand of every part of them. Ashford lingered by the door. She felt him there before she looked up. That specific weight of someone working up to a sentence they weren't entirely sure they wanted to say out loud, testing it silently first. The way you tested ice before committing your full weight to it. Commander. She looked up. That was... He stopped. Started again. I owe you an apology. For earlier, you don't owe me anything, Master Chief. She slid her folder into her bag, unhurried, deliberate. You owe the mission a readiness report by noon. That's the only debt currently on the table. He almost smiled. Almost noted, he left, and Reyna Voss stood alone in conference room 4, in a uniform that an hour ago had been called a rag by a man with 22 years and 11 deployments behind him, and felt, in that particular moment, absolutely nothing about it at all, which was, she would think later, its own kind of warning sign, because feeling nothing had never once, in 29 years, actually been the same thing as feeling fine. It only ever meant the feeling had gone somewhere else to wait. General Whitfield hadn't left with the others. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at a parking lot that didn't deserve that much sustained attention, and Reyna understood the way she understood weather, the way she understood the 4-count breath, the way she understood every silence her father had ever taught her to read, the way other people read faces, that he was waiting for the room to empty completely before he said whatever it was he'd actually come here to say. "You didn't need to do that," she said, once the door had clicked shut behind the last departing operator. "The bow in front of him, I know." "Then why?" Whitfield turned from the window. In the gray morning light, his face looked older than it had looked walking in barely 20 minutes earlier. The lines around his eyes cut deeper, the kind of tired that didn't come from one bad night but from decades of them, stacked one on top of the other until they became a permanent architecture nobody could dismantle anymore, not even the man wearing it, because your father would have wanted somebody in that room to know exactly who was standing in front of them. His voice had lost the parade ground clarity from the briefing entirely now. What remained was quieter, rougher, even if the somebody who finally knew it was an old man who took 18 years too long to say so out loud. Something tightened behind Reyna's sternum, small, familiar, the particular ache that showed up whenever her father's name entered a room uninvited, which was rare because she'd spent her entire adult life building around making sure it stayed uninvited, and it had worked, mostly, for years until moments exactly like this one, when it walked in anyway, wearing 4 stars and an apology nobody had thought to ask for. "We don't need to do this now." Her voice came out steadier than she actually felt, which was, she reflected privately, the entire skill set that had gotten her this far in life, the whole architecture of who she'd built herself into being. "We have a mission in 6 hours." "I know." Whitfield's jaw tightened. "I'm not trying to reopen anything, Commander. I'm trying to tell you." He stopped, started over, more careful this time, the way men got careful when the ground beneath a sentence felt thinner than they'd originally expected it to be. "I'm trying to tell you that I think about him. Still, more than I let on to anybody, including myself, most days. Don't." One word. Flat. The same flat she'd used on Ashford, except this time it cost her something to make it sound that way. And she suspected Whitfield could hear the cost even if nobody else in the entire world would have been able to. Reyna. Her first name. Not Commander. Not Voss. The kind of thing you only used with someone you'd known since, before they had a rank at all, and Whitfield had known her exactly that long, though not in any way either of them had ever once discussed out loud, not in 18 years of careful, professional, deliberate silence. "I need to be at the equipment cage in 40 minutes, she said. "Sir." Whitfield looked at her for a long moment, and whatever he'd been about to say, she could see it sitting behind his eyes, heavy, unspoken, the specific weight of a confession that hadn't quite found its courage yet, that was still gathering itself. The way weather gathered before it finally broke, he set it down, folded it away, the same way, she suspected, he'd probably folded away 100 other things over 18 years of choosing silence over the harder conversation, because silence was easier. Silence didn't require you to watch someone's face come apart in front of you. Of course. He straightened, and the parade ground version of him slid back over his face, like a door closing on a room nobody was allowed inside. "Holloway Ridge first. We'll talk after." "There's nothing to talk about." "There's always something to talk about, Commander." He moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, not looking back at her. "I just haven't had the nerve to start the conversation in 18 years. Doesn't mean it isn't there." He left, and Reyna stood alone in the conference room for the second time in 10 minutes, staring at a door that had just closed on a sentence she'd spent almost 2 decades making absolutely certain nobody would ever get the chance to finish. Because if General Marcus Whitfield had something to say about her father, 9, something he'd carried for 18 years, something heavy enough that his face changed shape around the edges of it, the exact way a doorway had once changed shape around her mother's face, then it wasn't nothing. It had never once been nothing. And some small, cold, 400-yard part of her, the part that had never, in her entire life, fully believed the official story about how Master Sergeant Elias Voss had died, filed that fact away. The same way it filed away Ashford's sweetheart, the same way it filed away everything it wasn't ready to use yet. Not yet, but soon. She could feel it approaching the way you felt weather approaching. A pressure change in the air long before the first drop actually fell. She went to the range instead of the equipment cage. Not the outdoor range from that morning. The indoor one. 3 floors down. Windowless. The kind of room where sound didn't travel anywhere except straight back at you, bouncing off concrete until it had nowhere left to go but into your own chest. She needed 30 minutes of nothing but breath and steel before she let Holloway Ridge fill up the rest of her day. And she needed, though she would not have admitted this to anyone, not even herself, not in so many words, not even inside her own head where honesty was supposed to be free, 30 minutes, with her eyes closed and her hands busy, so that the version of her that was 11 years old could come out from wherever she kept it folded away and finish crying where nobody else in the entire building could see. Because that was the thing about General Marcus Whitfield's face changing shape. It had happened once before, 18 years ago, in a doorway very much like the one he'd just walked through. Except that doorway had belonged to a house on a lake nobody could find on a map. And the face that changed shape that particular day hadn't belonged to a 4-star general. It had belonged to her mother. The lake house sat where the county road gave up and became gravel, where the gravel gave up and became dirt, and where the dirt eventually gave up too, dissolving into a shoreline that belonged to nobody official, just to the Voss family and the herons, and whatever weather happened to come down off the ridge that particular week. Reyna was 11. Small for 11, same as she would be small for every age that came after it, though nobody had told her yet that small and slow were 2 entirely different words, and it would take her years selection, deployments, an entire adult life built out of proving people wrong 1 room at a time to fully learn the difference for herself. Her father called it the range before breakfast. Her mother called it that man teaching our daughter to shoot before she can multiply fractions. Though she said it fondly, the specific fondness reserved for complaining about weather you secretly loved, the kind of complaint that wasn't really a complaint at all. Elias Voss didn't look like the men in movies. He was compact, unhurried. He moved through the world like someone who'd learned, a long time before Reyna was born, that noise was almost always a mistake, and that the men who survived long enough to have daughters were, almost without exception, the ones who'd figured that particular lesson out early. Breathe in, his voice low, patient, the same patient he brought to everything, teaching her to bait a hook, teaching her long division at the kitchen table, with the lake going dark outside the window, teaching her, later, the kinds of things a father maybe shouldn't teach an 11-year-old, but taught her anyway, because the world he'd lived in had convinced him, quietly and permanently, that she'd need it someday. Hold, now let it go slow. Find the gap. What gap? Between your heartbeats. He crouched beside her, adjusting the angle of her elbow with 2 fingers, gentle as anything he'd ever done. There's a half-second in there, right between one beat and the next. Everything's still in that half-second. The whole world just stops. That sounds made up. He laughed. A real laugh. Rare enough that she still remembered exactly what it sounded like. 18 years and 100 deployments, and 1 entire career later, the sound of it preserved somewhere she couldn't have explained to anyone if they'd asked her to. Everybody says that, until they find it. Did you find it? Every time it mattered. He straightened up, looked out at the water instead of at her, and something crossed his face that 11-year-old Reyna didn't have the vocabulary for yet, though 29-year-old Reyna would spend years learning that particular expression's proper name. Grief, worn thin and long, folded down into something that looked, from the outside, almost like calm. That's the only trick there ever is, Ray. Finding the stillness before people who love you start yelling for you to hurry up. She found it 3 shots later. Steel rang somewhere past the tree line, and her father's hand landed on her shoulder, solid and warm. And he didn't say good job the way other fathers said good job to other daughters. He just nodded, once, like she'd confirmed something he'd already known before she'd fired a single round. Your grandfather taught me that same gap, he said, on a range not much different from this one. And someday you'll teach it to somebody too. That's how it works. Nobody invents this stuff twice. Teach it to who? Don't know yet. He picked up her spent brass, rolled it once between 2 fingers, the way he did with everything, like he was reading it, like the metal itself had something to say if you handled it correctly. But you will. Trust me, the people who find that gap always end up teaching it to somebody, sooner or later, whether they mean to or not. He was wrong about one thing, though he couldn't have known it that particular morning. Crouched by the water with his daughter, and a rifle too big for her hands, and a whole life still ahead of both of them that neither one had any reason yet to fear. He never got the chance to see who she taught it to, because 6 months later, on a Tuesday that started exactly like every other Tuesday, 2 men in dress uniforms came up the gravel road in a government sedan that had no business on a road that quiet, and Reyna's mother's face changed shape in the doorway the way General Whitfield's face would change shape 18 years later in a conference room 3 states away. And after that Tuesday, there was no more breathe in, hold, let it go slow from her father's voice. Just a folded flag, a closed casket everyone told her not to ask about, and a sentence killed in action, overseas deployment, classified operational details that an 11-year-old girl memorized the way other kids memorized their multiplication tables, because it was the only answer she was ever going to get, and she would need it ready for every single person who ever asked her about it for the rest of her life, whether she wanted to give it to them or not. She never believed it. Not once. Not for a single one of the 18 years that followed, because her father had taught her to read stillness the way other people read faces, and there had been something in her mother's stillness, in the weeks and months after the funeral, that never quite matched the words on the page. A tightness around the eyes whenever certain names came up in the news. A drawer in the study that stayed locked long after the rest of the house had learned to breathe again. A single sentence, murmured once, late at night, that Reyna wasn't supposed to have heard and had never once, in 18 years, managed to forget. They didn't tell us everything, baby. They never tell us everything. Her mother died 4 years later, a different kind of quiet than the man who'd taught his daughter to find the gap between heartbeats. A hospital kind of quiet, slow and expected, and nothing at all like a folded flag, but quiet all the same. And it left 11-year-old turned 15-year-old Reyna with exactly 2 things: a house on a lake nobody could find on a map, and a question that had been growing teeth for 18 years. Patient, waiting, for the day somebody wearing 4 stars and a guilty face finally walked into a room and gave it something to finally bite down on. She opened her eyes. The indoor range hummed around her, fluorescent and windowless, steel targets standing patient 40 yards out. Her hands had already reloaded without her full permission muscle memory doing the job. Her conscious mind had wandered off from the same trick that had gotten her through selection, through 2 deployments, through every funeral she'd ever had to attend in a uniform that wasn't allowed to cry in public, not once, not even at the ones that had earned it. She fired. The shot went low, 2 inches off center, which for Reyna Voss was as good as a miss, because she didn't miss, hadn't missed anything that mattered in almost a decade, and the 2-inch drift told her exactly what she already knew without needing to be told. She wasn't thinking about Holloway Ridge. She was thinking about a doorway and a face changing shape, and 18 years of a sentence she'd swallowed so many times it had worn smooth going down. Except this morning, for the first time since she was 15 years old, somebody had looked at her like the sentence might finally, after all this time, be about to change. She set the rifle down, pressed the heel of her hand hard against her sternum, Once the way you'd press a bruise to check whether it still hurt. It still hurt. 18 years. And it still hurt exactly the same amount it had hurt on that Tuesday, which meant she understood with a clarity that felt almost cruel in its simplicity that she had never actually healed from any of it. She had simply gotten extremely, professionally good at looking like she had, which was a different skill entirely, and one that came, she was beginning to suspect, with a bill that eventually arrived whether you wanted it to or not. Her phone buzzed. Lindquist again. Equipment cage, 30 min, you good? She looked at the words for a long moment, then typed back the only answer she'd ever known how to give, the only answer her father had ever modeled for her, across an entire childhood of quiet mornings and quieter lessons, the only answer that had carried her from an 11-year-old with a rifle too big for her hands to a commander who outranked a room full of men who'd called her a rag 2 hours earlier. Fine, on my way. It wasn't true. It had never once been true, not for 18 years, but it was the closest thing to true she had available to her, and some days, she reminded herself, that simply had to be enough. It had been enough before. It would be enough today. The equipment cage was organized chaos gear, laid out in precise rows that only looked chaotic to somebody who hadn't spent a career learning the specific load-bearing logic underneath it. Ashford was already there, working through his elements loadout with the same focused silence he'd used in the briefing. After the coffee stopped dripping off his boot and onto the carpet nobody would ever bill him for, he looked up when she came in. Didn't smirk this time. Didn't say anything for a solid 10 seconds, which for a man like Ashford was its own quiet kind of apology, an apology that didn't need to use any words at all to still count. Commander, Master Chief, you look like you went 10 rounds with something. He said it carefully, testing the ground, the way you tested ice before committing your full weight to it. Everything square for the op? Everything's square. He studied her a moment longer than the answer strictly required, and something in his weathered, rebuilt face shifted. Not quite concern, because men like Ashford didn't do concern, not out loud, not on any record anyone could ever pull up later, but something adjacent to it. A recalibration, the same kind from the briefing room, except this one aimed at something underneath her uniform instead of at the uniform itself, whatever it is. He went back to his loadout, not looking at her now, offering her the small mercy of not having to hold his eyes, while she decided whether or not to answer him. Leave it here. Holloway Ridge doesn't care what's chewing on you. It just cares whether your head's actually in the room when the door goes. My head's in the room, Master Chief. Good. A pause. Then, quieter. Almost too quiet to catch over the rustle of gear and the distant hum of the ventilation system. For what it's worth. Whatever the general's carrying about you, it looked heavy. Man like that doesn't carry light things. Not in front of a room. Not without a reason. Reyna's hands stilled on the strap she was adjusting. You don't know anything about it. No, ma'am. He met her eyes then, and there was nothing mocking left in his face at all. Not one trace remaining of the man who'd called her uniform a rag 3 hours earlier. But I know weight when I see a man carrying it, and I know it when I see somebody trying real hard not to let it show on their own face, either. 22 years'll teach you that much, if nothing else. He went back to his gear, and Reyna Voss stood in an equipment cage full of men, checking rifles and radios, and 1,000 small mechanical certainties that made a mission possible at all, and thought for the first time in longer than she could easily remember that maybe the man who'd called her a rag 3 hours ago was about to become the first person in 18 years who noticed that she was carrying something and chose to respect it anyway, without demanding an explanation first. 1,300 hours. Full mission brief, second pass, every detail sharpened one more careful turn. Reyna stood at the head of the table again, Kestrel's authority sitting on her shoulders the way it had all morning. Except now, the room had recalibrated around her, nobody laughing, nobody calling her honey, 12 operators leaning forward instead of leaning back, listening the way professionals listened when they'd finally decided the person talking actually knew something worth hearing, something that might keep them alive later that night. Entry team goes through the east breach at 0100 local. She traced the line on the projected schematic, her finger steady, her voice level. Second element holds the north approach until we confirm hostages are secure. Nobody moves on the third ring until I give the word. I don't care what you see. I don't care what you hear. Nobody moves. And if that third rings live before we even get there. Ashford, from his seat, arms crossed, but leaning in now, actually listening now, in a way he hadn't bothered to that morning. You said yourself it wasn't on the last 6 weeks of overhead, which means we're walking blind into whatever's back there. Then we abort and regroup. She said it flat. No hesitation, the kind of answer that told everyone at the table she'd already war-gamed the worst version of this scenario, and had made her peace with the cost of walking away from it if the worst version turned out to be true. I don't send anybody into a ring we can't see the edges of. Not for 3 hostages. Not for anybody, no matter how good the reasons look on paper. Silence settled over the table, the particular silence of professionals recognizing a leader who meant exactly what she said. No more of it and no less. Copy that, Ashford said. And this time, when he said ma'am at the end of it, it didn't seem to cost him anything at all. She moved to close the brief. Final equipment checks, radio protocols, the small load-bearing details that made the actual difference between a mission that came home clean and one that made the 6 o'clock news for reasons nobody in this building ever wanted to see printed. And then Lindqvist, her ops chief, a quiet, careful man who'd been with Kestrel since before Reyna took command, who reads situations the way most people read weather reports, scanning for pressure changes long before anyone else in the room noticed the sky had shifted, slid a folder across the table toward her, his face carefully neutral in the specific way that Reyna had learned over 3 years of working alongside him, meant exactly the opposite of neutral. Final intel package, Commander. Signals came in an hour ago. Thought you'd want eyes on it before wheels up. She opened it. Satellite imagery, first. The compound from 3 different angles, the third ring circled in red where the analysts had finally caught a partial glimpse of it on a fresh pass. Personnel estimates, weapons caches, the standard architecture of a pre-mission package. Nothing in it that should have made her pulse do anything at all. Nothing that hadn't crossed her desk in some form 100 times before. Then the second page. A close-up. Grainy, enhanced twice over by somebody in an imagery lab who'd clearly worked hard to squeeze whatever detail they could out of very little raw material. A section of the compound's inner perimeter, a support beam, weathered, half hidden behind a stack of sandbags with a symbol scratched into the wood. Faint, old, the kind of mark that wouldn't have meant a single thing to anyone else in this entire building. Anyone except her. Because it wasn't a gang sign, wasn't a cartel marker, wasn't anything the analysts had a database entry for, which was exactly why they'd flagged it and passed it up the chain without further comment, hoping somebody further up the ladder might finally recognize it and tell them what they were looking at. It was 3 lines, a diagonal slash through a half circle, with a single dot beneath it. Reyna had seen that exact mark exactly once before in her entire life. Carved, crude, into the underside of a workbench in a garage on a lake nobody could find on a map, where an 11-year-old girl used to sit cross-legged on the concrete floor, while her father cleaned his gear and told her, without ever quite explaining what the mark actually meant, that this right here, Ray, that's how you know when it's really me, and not somebody just wearing my name. A signature, her father's private tactical signature, the mark he'd carved into equipment, into workbenches, into anything he needed to claim as unmistakably his own, in an era and a career where names got redacted on principle and units got renamed without explanation and paper trails got shredded on a schedule nobody outside 3 separate agencies had ever been allowed to see, carved onto a support beam, inside an active hostile compound, 11 miles outside a city she wasn't allowed to name aloud, in the year 2026. 18 years after, 2 men in dress uniforms drove up a gravel road and told a 15-year-old girl that her father had died overseas on a classified operation whose details would never, under any circumstances whatsoever, be released to the family he'd left behind on that lake. Reyna's hands did not shake. She'd trained them too well, over too many years, in too many rooms exactly like this one, for something like that to be allowed to happen now. But something behind her ribs went very, very still, the 4-count stillness the gap between heartbeats, the exact place her father had taught her to find, before anything in the world could reach far enough in to actually touch her. And into that stillness dropped a single, cold, absolutely certain thought, arriving whole and complete and impossible to argue with. He's alive. Or somebody wants me to believe he is. Which might in the end turn out to be so much worse. Commander? Lindqvist's voice, careful, watching her face the way careful men watched faces for a living, trained to catch exactly the kind of stillness she was fighting, not to let show. Everything all right. Reyna closed the folder, slid it into a bag without a word, the same unhurried, economical motion she'd used all day, the motion that had carried her through a room full of men who'd underestimated her, and a general who'd apologized without ever managing to finish the apology, and a memory of a doorway that had never once, in 18 years, stopped hurting when she let herself look at it directly. Everything's fine, she said. The lie came out smooth, practiced. 18 years of practice, in fact, though nobody sitting in that room had any way of knowing exactly how many years the practice had taken, or what it had cost her to build it that well. Wheels up in 90 minutes, she said, and closed her folder, and did not, for one single second, let her face reveal the 11-year-old girl, standing very still inside her chest, holding her breath, waiting after 18 years of waiting, after 18 years of a locked drawer and a murmured sentence and a question that had been growing teeth in the dark the entire time for the half-second gap between heartbeats, where the whole world would finally stop moving long enough for her to see clearly what was actually standing on the other side of it. The bird lifted off at 14:30 exactly, and Reyna Voss watched the base fall away beneath her through a window gone the color of wet slate. Fog again, because fog followed her lately, or maybe she followed it. Hard to say anymore which one was doing the chasing, and harder still to admit that the question had even occurred to her, because admitting it meant conceding that something about this particular Tuesday had already gotten under whatever armor she normally wore into these aircraft. She didn't open the folder in her lap. Didn't need to. Every line of the Holloway Ridge package had already burned itself into the back of her skull, the way things did when they mattered the entry points. The two visible rings, the third one that hadn't existed on satellite until 6 weeks ago, and now sat there circled in red like a wound somebody forgot to stitch closed. And underneath all of it, under every operational detail, her brain kept rehearsing on a loop it hadn't bothered asking permission to run. A symbol, scratched into wood, 3 lines and a dot, her father's signature, inside an active hostile compound. In the year 2026, she closed her eyes, found the 4 count in, hold, out slow, the gap between heartbeats where the whole world was supposed to stop. Except it didn't stop. Not today. Because today the gap had a face in it, and the face belonged to her father, and it refused to sit still long enough for her to actually look at it properly, which was new, which had never happened before. Not in 18 years of finding that gap on command, and the fact that it was happening now, on a bird descending toward a mission that mattered, frightened her more than she had room left to admit. Commander. Ashford's voice, low-pitched for her ear alone, though the cabin noise would have swallowed it from anyone sitting 3 feet farther away. She opened her eyes. He sat across from her. Gear already checked twice, rifle across his knees the way a man held something he trusted more than most people he'd ever met. Up close, in the flat cabin light, the scar through his eyebrow looked less like a warning now, and more like a map of every bad decision he'd survived long enough to properly regret. "You've been staring at that folder for 10 minutes without opening it," he said. "That a new technique, reading through the cover. It's called being prepared, Master Chief. It's called something's eating you." He didn't smile when he said it. That was new too. 6 hours ago he'd have wrapped a line like that in a smirk built for drawing blood. Now it just came out flat, almost gentle, in the careful way a person handled something they suspected might be fragile, even though it hadn't broken yet. "Not my business, I get that. But we're about to walk into a compound with a ring nobody can see the edges of, and I need to know the person calling the shots isn't somewhere else entirely in her own head when that door finally goes." Reyna looked at him for a long moment, because he wasn't wrong, because that was the maddening part of it, because 6 hours ago This man had called her uniform a rag in front of 11 other witnesses, and now he was the only person in the entire building who'd actually noticed something was wrong underneath her uniform, which told her either he was sharper than she'd given him credit for that morning, or she was worse at hiding things than 18 years of careful practice should have allowed her to be. "I'm here," she said, when the door goes. "I'm here." "That's not what I asked. It's the only answer you're getting." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not quite a smile. The ghost of respect finding its footing on unfamiliar ground, testing whether the ground would actually hold. "Copy that, Commander." He went back to his rifle. She went back to the window. And underneath it all, in the place she kept the things she wasn't ready to spend yet, the 11-year-old girl who'd found the gap between heartbeats for the first time on a lake nobody could find on a map, sat very still and waited and did not, for one single second of that entire flight, stop listening for a sound she hadn't heard in 18 years and had almost convinced herself she would never hear again. They came in low over the tree line at 2300, engines throttled back to a whisper that still sounded to Reyna's ears like the loudest thing in the entire world. Because that was the thing about silence right before an operation. It was never actually silent. It only felt that way, the same way a held breath felt like stillness, even though your lungs were screaming the whole time underneath it. Every sound got sharper in that particular hour. Every heartbeat got louder. Every 4-count breath became a countdown, whether you wanted it to or not, whether you'd asked for the countdown or simply inherited it the moment the aircraft dropped below a certain altitude. She checked her weapon, checked it again, though it hadn't changed in the 90 seconds since the last check, because that was ritual, not necessity. And rituals were the only thing keeping the 11-year-old girl quiet long enough to let the commander finish doing her job properly. Ashford's element went dark green against the tree line below, moving in the loose, practiced rhythm of men who'd done this so many times their bodies had stopped needing instructions from their brains at all. Muscle memory carrying weight that thought no longer had to. Second element held the north approach, exactly where she'd placed them, exactly as planned down to the meter, which left the third ring, the one that hadn't existed 6 weeks earlier, the one with a symbol carved into a support beam that only one person on this entire aircraft would have recognized on sight. And that person was sitting very still in the Obstbird, with her hands folded in her lap like a woman at church, waiting for a door to open on something that might change the rest of her life. Her radio clicked once. Lindqvist, from the operations bird, trailing half a click back, his voice already carrying the flattened, careful tone he used whenever the ground had started shifting under a plan he'd helped build. "Commander, we've got movement inside the second perimeter. 2, maybe 3 hostiles, standard patrol pattern. Nothing on the third ring yet. Copy. Hold entry until Ashford's element confirms the east breach is clean." "Copy that." She watched the compound grow larger through the aircraft's thermal feed. Squat buildings, corrugated roofs, the particular ugliness of structures built fast and cheap by people who'd never once intended to stay very long. Somewhere inside one of them, 3 American hostages were waiting for a rescue they had no way of knowing was already, at this exact moment, in motion above their heads. And somewhere inside the third ring, the one nobody in this entire operation could see the edges of a signature that shouldn't exist. Waiting, patient as a held breath, to mean something it had no earthly right to mean. She pushed the thought down, because that was the discipline. Because you didn't get to become a person your father would have recognized by letting a mark on a beam distract you from 3 people who were going to die if you allowed yourself to get distracted at exactly the wrong second of exactly the wrong minute. East breach in 60 seconds. Ashford's voice crackled through, tight and low. All business now. Every trace of the tarmac and the conference room burned entirely out of it. In position. Copy. Execute on my mark. The bird descended. Trees rose up close enough to touch, close enough that for one disorienting second the world seemed to be made entirely of branches reaching for the aircraft's belly. And Reyna Voss found the gap between her heartbeats one more time. The same gap her father had taught her to find on a lake, nobody could find on a map, and held it there, patient still, waiting for the exact half-second the world was about to require of her. Mark. The breach went textbook for the first 90 seconds. Ashford's element moved through the east wall in a formation so clean. It looked almost gentle on the thermal feed, 4 bodies flowing into a structure like water, finding the exact shape of a container. No wasted motion, no wasted sound, no hesitation anywhere in it. 2 hostiles down before either one of them finished turning around. A third taken alive, zip-tied, dragged clear of the doorway, before he'd fully processed what had actually happened to him in the space of 4 seconds. East breach secure. Ashford's voice, calm, professional, nothing left in it now that sounded like a man who 3 hours ago had called her a rag in front of a room full of witnesses. Hostages located, all 3 alive. Moving to extraction point, Reyna exhaled. Not the 4 count, just relief, plain and human. The kind that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the fact that 3 people who'd woken up that morning terrified were about to get the chance to go home to whatever lives they'd been ripped out of. Copy, Master Chief. Second element, hold your position until the compound lit up. Not gunfire. Something else first. A whine that climbed fast and mean. The specific sound of an alarm system nobody had accounted for, screaming into the night from somewhere inside the second perimeter. The intel package had marked clean 4 hours earlier, back when 4 hours had still felt like enough time to know anything for certain. We've got a problem. Lindqvist's voice, suddenly not careful at all. The flatness cracked clean through. Motion sensors. They weren't on the last pass. Somebody upgraded their perimeter in the last 6 hours, and nobody caught it. Reyna's stomach dropped. Because 6 hours. Because the mission had only existed on paper for 18. Because that math left almost no room for coincidence, and every bit of room for exactly the kind of leak she'd warned the room about that very morning. In that same conference room, in front of witnesses who'd all promised her their silencer. Ashford, get your element moving. Now copy moving gunfire. Sudden, ugly, close enough that she could hear it directly through Ashford's open channel, a half-second before the thermal feed caught the muzzle flashes blooming along the second perimeter's edge, a string of small white blossoms that meant men she was responsible for were, at that precise moment, in more danger than the plan had ever promised them. Contact east. Contact east. We are taking fire from the second ring. I say again, second ring is live. Reyna's hands went very still on the console in front of her. Because the second ring wasn't supposed to be live. Because the intel said standard patrol density. 2 or 3 hostiles. Nothing that should have turned into this wall of sustained fire, lighting up the thermal feed in a pattern that told her, with 6 certainty, that somebody inside that compound had known exactly which hour American operators were coming through that wall. How many hostiles? She said, and her voice didn't shake, because it wasn't allowed to, not now, not with 3 men trapped in a crossfire that shouldn't have existed at all. Too many to count from here. Commander, we are pinned. I say again, we are pinned. She looked at the schematic, at the third ring, at the place on the map where a piece of her father's history had been carved into a support beam by someone who either knew exactly what that symbol meant, or had copied it from someone who did and understood precisely what it would do to whoever eventually saw it. And she made a decision that would have gotten her relieved of command in any building less desperate than the one she currently occupied above a burning compound. Second element, breach the third ring now. Commander, that's outside the plan. Lindqvist's voice, sharp with alarm, sharper than she'd ever heard it. We don't know what's in there. I know exactly what might be in there. The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them, and she caught them, held them, refused to explain further because there wasn't time, and because some things simply didn't survive explanation under fire, not with 3 men's lives sitting on the other side of the sentence. It's the only unguarded approach into that compound. Every hostile they've got is pouring into the second ring to pin Ashford's element down, which means the third ring is thin, which means it's our way in, and it's the only way in we have left. Silence on the line. A half-second only, but it stretched the way certain half-seconds did, long and taut, the kind of silence that had its own gravity. Copy, Commander. Breaching third ring. What happened over the next 4 minutes would become, in the official after-action report, that nobody outside 6 people would ever be cleared to read a single flat paragraph. Second element breached the compound's undocumented tertiary perimeter, drawing hostile fire away from the pinned primary element and enabling successful extraction of all personnel. It would not mention the way Reyna's hands shook, once briefly, watching the thermal feed show her operators running into a structure that hadn't existed on any map 4 hours earlier, running into an unknown, the way you ran into water at night, trusting depth you couldn't actually see. It would not mention the 15 seconds, where the feed went dark entirely, some kind of jamming, brief and localized, the compound's last desperate trick, and Reyna stood in the ops bird, with her whole body gone cold and still, waiting, the way she'd once waited on a gravel road 18 years earlier for a car that never should have existed to finish driving up to a house on a lake, every second of that old waiting folding itself, unbidden, into this new one. It would not mention that when the feed came back and Ashford's voice crackled through with hostages secure, all personnel accounted for, moving to extraction, she had to grip the console edge hard enough to leave marks in her own palm, just to keep her knees from doing something entirely undisciplined in front of 6 people who needed to believe, unconditionally, that she was always exactly as steady as she looked. What the report would say, in its flat bureaucratic language, was that the operation succeeded. 3 hostages recovered alive, 12 hostiles neutralized or detained, 0 American casualties. What it wouldn't say, because there was no box on the form for it, no line item in any after-action template ever designed by anyone, was that somewhere in the middle of that 4 minutes, Master Chief Dane Ashford, pinned down under fire that shouldn't have existed, had looked at a tactical call that broke every rule in the standard playbook and decided, in the half-second he had to decide anything at all, to trust it completely, without hesitation, without demanding a reason first. He'd trust her with his life. He hadn't known her 12 hours earlier. He'd called her uniform a rag less than 12 hours earlier. In fact, and here he was betting 4 men's lives on a call she couldn't fully explain even to herself. That was the thing the report would never capture. That, in the end, was the thing that mattered most. The bird touched down at 0400, and Reyna was on the tarmac before the rotors had fully wound down, moving through the controlled chaos of a mission's end medics, checking hostages who kept saying I'm fine in the specific shaky voice of people who very much were not, operators stripping gear with the particular exhausted efficiency of men who'd just spent the worst 4 minutes of their entire month doing exactly what a decade of training had built them to do. Ashford found her by the equipment cages, helmet off, sweat-dark hair plastered to his forehead, a shallow cut above one eyebrow that would scar next to the old one and give his face one more story it wasn't ever going to volunteer to anyone who asked. That call, he said it without preamble, without the mockery, without anything at all except the flat, stunned honesty of a man still coming down off adrenaline hard enough that his hands hadn't quite stopped moving. Breaching the third ring. That was either the smartest thing I've seen a commander do in 11 deployments, or the craziest thing, and I genuinely cannot tell you which one it was. Can it be both? Something that was almost a laugh moved through his chest, surprising them both. Yeah, I guess it can at that. He studied her for a long moment. The tarmac lights threw everything into flat, white and deep shadow, and in that light, his face looked older than it had looked in the conference room. Softer, somehow. The mockery burned all the way out of it, and something more honest sitting in the space it left behind. You knew something was in that third ring, he said. Before we breached it, you said it like you knew it, not like you were guessing. Reyna's jaw tightened, because he wasn't wrong, because she'd bet 3 men's lives on a hunch, built entirely out of a symbol carved into a support beam, and it had worked, and that terrified her, more than it probably should have, because hunches that worked had a way of making you trust the next one without question, and the next hunch might not have 3 men's worth of luck standing quietly behind it. I had a read on the pattern, she said. That's all it was, Commander. He held her eyes, steady, unwilling to let the sentence go that easily. I've worked with a lot of people who had a red on a pattern. What you had wasn't a red. It was a certainty. And I'd like to know, someday, where a person gets that kind of certainty about a compound nobody in this building had eyes on until 6 weeks ago. That's not a conversation for a tarmac, Master Chief. No, he agreed. Quiet, careful. The same careful he'd used in the equipment cage that afternoon, testing ice before he trusted it with his full weight. But it's a conversation whenever you're ready to have it. No pressure attached, Commander. I've got nowhere else better to be. He didn't push further. That was new too. 12 hours ago, the man had pushed on everything. Mockery deployed like a battering ram against anything that dared stand in his way. And now he was standing on a tarmac at 4 in the morning, exhausted and bleeding slightly from a fresh cut, choosing patience over pressure for a woman he'd insulted before he'd understood a single true thing about her. Reyna watched him walk toward the medics, and something behind her sternum, the same place that had ached all day, the same place holding 18 years of a sentence she'd swallowed so many times, it had worn smooth, loosened, very slightly, for the first time since a gravel road and a government sedan and a doorway that changed shape had rewritten the entire architecture of her childhood in a single Tuesday afternoon. Not trust yet. Trust took longer than one mission, longer than one tarmac, longer than 12 hours of watching a man's face slowly rearrange itself around a person he'd misjudged. But something, a door left open a crack, in case she ever decided, on some future night, she couldn't yet see the shape of, to walk through it. The prisoner sat in a room with no windows, 3 floors beneath a building that officially didn't run detention operations. In a chair bolted to the floor because bolted chairs discouraged certain kinds of optimism in the people forced to sit in them. Reyna had requested this interrogation herself, over Lindqvist's mild objection that's not standard protocol. Commander, we have people trained for exactly this, with an answer that ended the discussion before it had properly started. I am the people trained for this. Which was, strictly speaking, a lie, but not one anyone in the building had the standing to challenge, not given the morning she'd had, and the 4 stars who'd bowed to her in front of a room full of witnesses who were, already, by now, quietly retelling the story to anyone who'd listen. The man across the table was young, younger than she'd expected, in fact, with the specific hollow-eyed look of someone who'd signed up for a paycheck and gotten a war instead. A look she'd seen on a dozen faces across a dozen years, and had never once managed to grow entirely numb to. Name, she said. He said nothing. She let the silence sit, because silence deployed correctly did more work than questions ever managed to do on their own. Her father had taught her that too, though not on a firing range, in the kitchen of the lake house, watching him work a difficult vendor down on a fishing boat price over the course of an entire uncomfortable dinner, saying almost nothing at all, letting the other man's own discomfort do the negotiating for him. 4 minutes passed. The prisoner's legs started bouncing under the table. "You're not going to hurt me," he said finally, testing the theory out loud, the way people did when they needed to hear it confirmed or denied by somebody with actual authority to decide it. Americans don't do that. Not officially, anyway. Officially, Reyna agreed. No, she let that sit too. Watched his leg bounce faster, watched the specific way fear moved through a young body that hadn't yet learned to hide it properly. "I want to talk about the 3rd ring," she said. "The one your people built in the last 6 weeks. Tell me who ordered the construction. And I promise you, this conversation gets considerably shorter. I don't know anything about construction schedules. You're just a guard. I know. Everyone I've ever interrogated in my entire career was just a guard." She leaned forward, slow, deliberate, the same economical movement she used for everything she did. "Here's what I actually want to know. And I think you can answer it, because I think you were standing post near that support beam more nights than you'd like to admit to me right now." She set the photograph on the table. The symbol, 3 lines, a diagonal slash, a single dot. The prisoner's face did something involuntary. Small, fast, gone almost before it had finished registering on his features. But she'd spent her entire life reading stillness, reading the half-second gaps where truth lived before people remembered to hide it away again. and she caught that flicker the way she caught a target at 400 yards. Clean, certain, unmistakable. "You've seen this before," she said, not a question. "I don't know what that is." "You do." Her voice hadn't risen. It never rose. "Your face just told me you do. So let's skip the part where you lied to me for another 20 minutes and go straight to the part where you tell me the truth, because I promise you, we have all night, and I am considerably more patient than you are currently." Frightened, the prisoner's jaw worked. His eyes went to the photograph, then away, then back, unable to leave it alone. The way a tongue couldn't leave a sore tooth alone, no matter how much it hurt to keep touching it. "It's old," he said finally. Quiet, almost reluctant, like the words themselves were costing him something he hadn't budgeted for when he woke up that morning. "Older than the compound. Older than the network even. There's a man, he's not one of us. Not really. He's the others treat him different, like he's earned something the rest of us haven't." Reyna's pulse did not change. She would not let it change. But somewhere behind her ribs, the 11-year-old girl went very, very still, listening with everything she had left in her to listen with. "What man?" "I don't know his real name. Nobody uses real names. But he's American. Was American. I mean military. A long time ago. Before any of this. He's the one who carved that mark. Told one of the others it was a signature. Said it belonged to somebody served with. Somebody who died a long time ago and never should have." The room went silent in a way that had nothing left to do with interrogation technique. "Died," Reyna repeated. Her voice came out level, flat. Every ounce of 18 years of practice went into keeping it exactly that way, into not letting a single crack show through. "He said the man died. That's what he told them. But..." The prisoner hesitated, looked at the photograph one more time, and something in his face shifted from fear into something closer to genuine confusion. The look of a man repeating a story he'd never fully believed himself, not even the first time he'd heard it. But he also told it different ways, different times. Once he said the man died in the field. Another time he said the man got left behind. Sacrificed, he called it. Sacrificed for something bigger. He gets strange talking about it, like it's the only thing that's ever really mattered to him in his whole life. This man, where is he now? I don't know. He doesn't stay in one place. He moves between compounds, between operations. He's the one who built the third ring here, knew exactly how the Americans would come in, knew the timing, the approach, like he'd done this exact thing himself, 100 times before, on the other side of it. Reyna sat very still, because that was the profile of somebody who'd once worn the same uniform the operators upstairs were currently peeling off their exhausted bodies. Somebody who understood American tactics from the inside, because he'd been trained in them himself, by someone, somewhere, a long time ago. Somebody who talked about a man who'd been sacrificed for something bigger, and carried that man's private signature into every compound he built afterward, like a grief he couldn't set down and refused to explain to anyone who dared ask him about it. "What's his name?" she said. "Not his real one, whatever they call him around here." The prisoner's leg had stopped bouncing entirely now. He looked, for just a moment, less like a hostile combatant and more like a young man very far from home who had gotten in over his head with people who frightened him considerably more than she did, and probably always had. "Kane," he said. "They call him Kane." Reyna left the interrogation room and walked directly into a wall that turned out to be Lindqvist, waiting exactly where she'd known he would be waiting, because that was the job. And because he'd read her face through the one-way glass the entire time, without needing to hear a single word of it. "You need to sit down," he said. "I need a name run. Kane, Kane. Cross-reference every special operations personnel database going back 30 years. American, possibly deceased on paper, possibly not deceased at all." Commander now Lindqvist. He didn't argue further. That was the thing about Lindqvist. 3 years working under her, and he'd learned exactly which tone meant argue with me, and which tone meant do the job and grieve about it later, in private, on your own time. This was very clearly the second one, and he was already moving before she'd finished the sentence. He left. She stood alone in the corridor, 3 floors underground, in a building with no windows anywhere in it, and pressed the heel of her hand hard against her sternum, the way she had on the indoor range that morning, checking a bruise to see if it still hurt, already half knowing the answer, before her hand even landed. It hurt worse now, because now it had a name attached to it. Cain. She didn't recognize it. Not from her father's old letters, carefully preserved in a box back at the lake house she still owned and almost never visited anymore. Not from the handful of names her mother had murmured, late at night, in the years before the hospital quiet took her too. Quiet and slow and nothing at all like a folded flag. Not from anything she could pull up in the whole of her memory, no matter how hard she searched it, which meant either Cain was a name that had simply never been spoken in her presence, deliberately kept from her, by people who decided that an 11-year-old, and then a 15-year-old, and then a 29-year-old commander didn't need to carry it, or it meant something considerably worse, that the man who called himself Cain had a reason of his own for staying invisible to her specifically for 18 unbroken years, while carving her father's private signature into support beams in compounds, and full of people who would shoot American operators on sight without a second thought. Her phone buzzed. Whitfield requests your presence. His office. Now, Elle. She looked at the message for a long moment, longer than the words themselves required. Then she thought about a conference room that morning, and a general's face changing shape, and a sentence he'd folded away instead of finishing. I just haven't had the nerve to start the conversation in 18 years. Doesn't mean it isn't there. 18 years. And the conversation had finally found its nerve, at 4 in the morning, in an underground building, on very possibly the worst possible day either of them could have chosen for it. She went. Whitfield's office looked exactly like a man who'd spent 41 years learning not to keep anything personal in a room other people could see into. A flag precisely folded on its stand. A desk clear enough to eat off of. 2 photographs, both official, both carrying the specific stiff formality of ceremony rather than memory. Nothing in either frame that gave anything real away. He stood when she entered, didn't sit back down until she had. You interrogated the prisoner yourself, he said. Not a question. His eyes carried the particular tired weight from that morning, deepened now. 3 in the morning, kind of tired, stacked heavy, on top of 18 years of an older, deeper exhaustion that had clearly never once been allowed to fully rest. Against protocol, I had my reasons, I know you did. He set both hands flat on the desk, mirroring, without seeming to mean to, the exact gesture she'd used on Ashford 12 hours earlier in a different room entirely. Because I already know what he told you, or close enough to it. I've had a man inside that network's outer circle for 2 years, Commander. Longer than Kestrel's existed. Longer than you've held this command. Reyna's jaw tightened. Then you knew about Cain. Silence. The particular silence that answered a question more completely than any words ever could have managed. General, sit down, Reyna. I am sitting down. Then stay sitting down. Because what I'm about to tell you is going to make you want to stand up. And I need you to hear before you do anything with your hands or your voice that either one of us is going to spend the rest of our lives regretting. Something cold moved through her chest. The 4-count breath. In. Hold out slow. Your father didn't die in the field, Whitfield said. The words landed like something physical. Not a shock exactly some part of her had known for 18 years, had quietly built an entire life around a certainty she'd never once been allowed to say out loud to anyone. Not her mother, not a single friend, not even herself in the privacy of her own head most days. But hearing it, from a 4-star general's mouth, in an office with a flag and 2 ceremonial photographs, and no personal warmth anywhere in the room to soften any of it, that was an entirely different thing from simply knowing. Then how? She said, flat, controlled, every ounce of 18 years of practice keeping her voice level while something enormous cracked open underneath it. Quietly, without any outward sign at all, there was an operation. 2008. Classified above anything you've ever had access to. Even now, even with everything Kestrel clears you for on paper. Whitfield's voice had gone rough, stripped entirely of the parade ground clarity, down to something that sounded almost like confession finally finding its way out, after too many years locked behind his teeth. Your father was part of a joint task force, running deep cover inside a network we believed was preparing to move weapons-grade material through 3 states. We had 6 weeks of intelligence, we had a window, and 2 days before the operation was supposed to execute, we got word the network had made one of our people. Made who? Your father. Whitfield's eyes didn't leave hers, though it clearly cost him everything he had left to keep them there and not look away. The network figured out Reyna Voss wasn't who he claimed to be. And the choice in front of us, the choice I was in the room for, Commander, the choice I personally voted on, was pull the entire operation and lose the window forever, or let your father maintain cover long enough to complete the mission, knowing there was a real, calculated chance it would cost him his life. Reyna's hands had gone very still in her lap, stiller than stillness. The specific kind of still that came right before something finally broke apart. You sacrificed him. We made a decision. Whitfield's voice cracked, very slightly, on the word decision, the first crack she had ever heard in it, across 18 years of knowing this man from a careful, professional distance. She'd never once let herself close. I've spent 18 years telling myself it was the right one. 3 states. Weapons-grade material. Thousands of lives that never had to be at risk because your father held his cover 4 more days than any of us had the right to ask a man to hold it. And then he died, and then we lost contact. Whitfield's jaw worked, the muscle in it visibly tightening. The official story killed in action, classified operational details. That's what we told your mother, because it was the closest thing to true we were authorized to say to her. We believed it was true. For years I believed it completely, without a shred of doubt. There was no extraction, no confirmed sighting afterward. Every single indicator said he didn't survive the operation's final 48 hours. Every indicator except a symbol. Reyna's voice had gone very quiet now. Dangerously quiet, the quiet that lived right before a shot, carved into a support beam, in a compound built 6 weeks ago, by a man named Cain, who tells people, your father was sacrificed for something bigger, and gets strange talking about it, like it's the only thing that's ever mattered to him in his entire life. Whitfield's face had gone the color of old paper. Cain, he said. You're certain that's the name he used? I'm certain. The general stood, walked to the window, the same posture he'd held in the conference room that morning, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at nothing in particular, because looking directly at her had apparently become, in the last 30 seconds, more than even a 4-star general could manage to hold steady. There was a man on that task force, he said, to the window, not to her, as though the glass might absorb some of the weight the words carried before they reached her ears. Staff Sergeant, ran point on the deep cover element alongside your father. The 2 of them were closer than most operators ever get, closer than the job usually allows, because your father had a particular way of making people trust him faster than was strictly wise for either party. His name was Silas Cain. Reyna's whole body went cold. He was there, Whitfield continued, voice rougher now, dragging each word out, like it weighed something physical he had to lift with his own hands. When the decision got made to hold the operation, he fought it harder than anyone else in that room, harder than I did, harder than anyone. Said we were sending Elias to die for a mission that could have waited 1 more week for a cleaner window. Nobody listened. I didn't listen. And when your father didn't come home, Cain held me personally responsible for it. Told me so, to my face, before he was quietly separated from service, 8 months later, under circumstances such as the Navy never fully explained to me, and frankly, Commander, I never once fully asked them to. Separated, meaning discharged, meaning disappeared mostly in every way that matters. Whitfield turned from the window, finally, and the face he showed her was the face of a man 18 years older than the one who'd bowed to her that morning in front of a room full of witnesses. We lost track of him for years after that. There were rumors private contractor work, some of it legitimate, some of it very much not. Nothing that ever crossed a threshold serious enough to put him back on anyone's radar again. The room went very quiet. Reyna sat with her hands folded in her lap, in a chair across from a 4-star general who had just told her that her father might have died a hero, or might have been left behind by his own government to die a hero's death that never actually happened the way anyone had claimed. and that the man responsible for whichever version turned out to be true had spent 18 years turning his own grief into an army, built out of other people's desperation. "I need everything you have on Kane," she said. "Flat, final, every file, every rumor, every scrap of surveillance from the last 18 years, classified or not, no matter what it costs either of us to hand it over. Reyna, you owe me this, General." Her voice cracked, finally, on the word "oh," the first crack in her own armor since a doorway on a lake had taught her, at 11 years old, exactly how to build one in the first place and never once let it fall. 18 years. You knew, you've known this whole time, and you let me carry a story you didn't even fully believe yourself. I let you believe the only story I had confirmation for. Whitfield's voice broke too, and for a moment, the 4 stars on his shoulders looked like the single heaviest thing in the entire room. Heavier than the desk, heavier than the flag, heavier than 18 years of silence stacked one careful year on top of the other. "I never had proof he was alive, Commander. I still don't have it now. What you have is a symbol carved by a man who might be honoring your father's memory, or might be using it as bait, and I need you to understand that the difference matters enormously. Because if Kane knows exactly who you are, if he knows the daughter of the man he blames me for killing is the commander who's just been sent to hunt his network, then he's not hiding," Reyna said, quiet, certain, the pieces sliding into place with the terrible clean logic of a shot she already knew would land before she'd even finished the trigger pull. "He's calling me." Whitfield said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was its own confirmation, the same way it had been in the conference room that morning. And Reyna understood, sitting in that clear, cold office at 4 a.m, that the mission she'd believed she was running had never once, from the very beginning, been the mission that actually mattered. The mission that mattered had started 18 years ago on a gravel road, and it had been waiting for her, patient as weather, the entire time. She didn't sleep, didn't try. Instead, she sat in the small, windowless office Kestrel had allotted her, barely bigger than a closet, because the task force didn't officially exist and unofficial things didn't get real estate anyone could put a name to on a floor plan and spread 18 years of a life she had never fully let herself examine across a desk too small to hold all of it properly. Her father's file, what little of it Whitfield had finally released, heavily redacted, black bars swallowing whole paragraphs, the way the fog had swallowed the tree line on the range that morning, a lifetime ago, though it had only been 18 hours since she'd stood in that particular gray. Kane's file, thinner still, mostly rumor stitched together with the kind of careful caveats analysts used when they didn't fully trust their own sources. Unconfirmed, possible alias, whereabouts unknown 2019 present, and underneath both of them, a photograph she'd pulled from her own personal effects, carried in every duty bag she had owned since she was 15 years old, worn soft at every corner from 18 years of quiet, private handling. Her father, younger than she remembered him, standing beside a man she'd never once been told the name of, both of them in fatigues too clean to have seen real dirt yet, both of them grinning the specific reckless grin of young men who hadn't yet learned what the job would eventually cost either of them. She'd never known the other man's name. She knew it now. Silas Kane stood beside her father in a photograph that had traveled with her through selection, through 2 deployments, through every funeral she'd ever attended, in a uniform that wasn't allowed to cry, and she had carried his face for 18 years, without once knowing what, exactly, she was carrying. A knock at the door, soft, careful. Ashford. He stood in the doorway, with 2 cups of coffee, still in the same uniform from the mission, sweat dark and exhausted, the cut above his eyebrow now cleaned and closed, with 2 small strips of tape. Lindqvist said, "You hadn't left this office in 3 hours." He set 1 cup down on the edge of her desk, without being asked, the way you'd approach a wounded animal, careful, unhurried, no sudden moves that might spook whatever was already fragile in the room. Figured you might need this more than you needed to be told to sleep, and figured you'd argue with the second one, so I skipped straight to the coffee. "I don't need to sleep." "No," he agreed. "You need to sleep. Those are 2 different things. Commander, and you're smart enough to already know it, which is exactly why you're not going to bother arguing with me about it." He looked at the desk. At the photograph, face up, the two young men grinning at a camera 18 years and an entire lifetime ago. "That your father?" Reyna didn't answer right away, because answering meant explaining, and explaining meant handing this man who 12 hours ago had called her uniform a rag, who 24 hours ago hadn't even known her name, a piece of the thing she had spent 18 years protecting from everyone, including, most days, herself. "Yes," she said finally. Ashford didn't push. He looked at the photograph, a moment longer, respectful, unhurried, and then looked back up at her. "He taught you the range," Ashford said. "Not a question. The stillness thing. The gap between heartbeats." Reyna's chest tightened. "How would you know about that?" "I don't. Not the details of it." He shrugged, and something in the gesture was almost gentle, almost apologetic. A man feeling his way carefully around ground he clearly understood was fragile, even though nobody had told him exactly where the cracks ran. "But I've watched you find that gap twice now. Once on the range this morning, before you even knew I was standing there. Once in that briefing room right before you shut me down without raising your voice one single time. That's not training, Commander. Training gets you competent. That kind of stillness. Somebody has to love you enough to teach you that, and it usually only comes from one place in a person's whole life." Reyna looked at him for a long moment, and something in her, something that had been locked 18 years, bolted the way that interrogation chair 3 floors down was bolted to its own floor, loosened, just slightly, not open. Not yet, but unlatched, for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit to anyone, including the man standing patiently in her doorway. "He's not dead," she said. The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them, quiet, raw, the first time she'd spoken them out loud to another living person in 18 years, of believing them privately, alone, in the dark, where nobody could tell her she was wrong. Ashford didn't flinch, didn't ask her to repeat it, didn't ask if she was certain, didn't do any of the small deflecting things a lesser man might have done to fill the silence with his own discomfort instead of holding space for hers. He just nodded, once, the way her father used to nod, all those years ago, on a range beside a lake, confirming something he had already known, before she'd even finished proving it. "Then we find him," he said. "Simple, certain, whatever that ends up taking. You don't know what you're volunteering for." "No," he agreed. "But I know what I saw 12 hours ago. A commander who bet 3 men's lives on a hunch and turned out to be exactly right about every part of it. I don't need to know the whole story to know which side of this I've already picked, Commander. I picked it back on that tarmac if you want the honest truth." Reyna felt something behind her eyes that hadn't shown up there in longer than she could easily remember, and she blinked it back, the way she'd blinked back everything for 18 years. Fast, practiced, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking as closely as Ashford apparently was. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, all she had room left for. "Drink your coffee." He straightened, moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame, the exact same gesture Whitfield had used that morning, though the 2 men couldn't have been more different in every other way that mattered. "For what it's worth, whatever's coming next, you're not walking into it alone anymore. Wanted you to know that before you convinced yourself otherwise, which I'm guessing is exactly what you were already halfway to doing." He left, and Reyna Voss sat alone in her small windowless office. 18 years of grief and certainty spread across a desk, too small to hold all of it, and for the first time since a doorway had changed shape on a gravel road when she was 11 years old, she let herself believe just slightly, just enough to notice the difference that she might not have to carry every ounce of it by herself anymore. The financial records came back at dawn, and they came back wrong, in exactly the way Reyna had feared they might, in the specific quiet way bad news always seemed to prefer arriving not as a shout, but as a printout laid gently on a table by someone who already knew what it meant before he handed it over. Not wrong like fraud. Wrong like grief wearing a disguise it hadn't quite finished sewing. Because that was the thing about people who broke under pressure, they rarely broke for money. Not really, not down at the root of it. They broke for something closer to the bone. Something that looked, on a balance sheet, like nothing at all until you knew exactly where to dig and why. Lindqvist laid the printout on the table without a word, which told her everything before she'd read a single line, because Lindqvist always had words. Lindqvist was built out of words, careful ones, precise ones, the kind he chose the way other men chose ammunition. His silence now was its own kind of confession, and she felt the weight of it before she'd even looked down. She read it twice, then a third time, because the first 2 times, her brain had simply refused the information the way a body sometimes refused a diagnosis, waiting for a doctor to say just kidding before the word cancer finished landing all the way down. "This can't be right," she said. "I ran it 4 times, Commander." Lindqvist's voice had gone thin, stretched. 4 different databases. Same answer every single time. Analyst Priya Okonkwo Faro Imagery Team, one of only 6 people who'd touched the Holloway Ridge intelligence before it ever went live. 11 years of clean service behind her, 2 commendations framed somewhere in a home Reyna had never seen, a husband in the reserves, and a son with a rare kidney condition that had, over the past 18 months, accumulated medical debt with more zeros in it than an intelligence analyst's salary could ever hope to outrun. No matter how carefully she budgeted, no matter how many extra shifts she picked up, and 6 weeks ago, the same 6, the third ring had appeared out of nowhere on satellite. The same 6 weeks Kane's network had suddenly started fighting with tactics that looked disturbingly precisely American. An anonymous account had begun making payments against that debt. Quiet, untraceable through any of the normal channels. The kind of untraceable that took real money and real patience to arrange. The kind that meant somebody had been watching this woman for a long time before they ever made a move. "She's not dirty," Ashford said, low, almost to himself, standing at the edge of the table with his arms crossed like he needed something to hold on to. "She's drowning. Doesn't matter which," Reyna said, and hated how flat her own voice sounded even to her own ears. Hated that 18 years of discipline could turn even this into something clinical, something processed and filed instead of felt. Either way, our intelligence has been walking straight out the door in real time. Every hour, every move we make, somebody on the other side already knows it before we finish making it, because that was the horror of it, sitting underneath everything else. Not malice, just a mother terrified for her son, offered a quiet way out by someone patient enough to watch and wait for exactly the right kind of desperate person to finally notice the hand being extended toward her, which meant Kane hadn't just found a leak, he'd built one, on purpose, out of somebody's love for their child, the one thing in the world nobody could ever be shamed out of protecting. Whitfield, standing at the window with his back to the room, the way he always stood when a piece of news cost him something real, didn't turn around for a long moment. "Bring her in," he said finally. "Quiet, gently, Commander." He finally turned, and his face had gone the color of old paper again, the same color it had worn in his office 3 nights earlier, under the weight of everything he'd finally said out loud. "She's not our enemy. She's a casualty we haven't finished counting yet. I want her protected before anything else happens to her or her boy, and I want whatever she can tell us about exactly how Kane found her in the first place, because that answer is going to tell us more about him than anything we've pulled from a file in 18 years. Okonkwo Faro didn't fight when they came for her, didn't run, didn't raise her voice, didn't do any of the things guilt usually made people do when guilt still had teeth left in it. She sat in the small interview room, not the one 3 floors down, with the bolted chair, a gentler one, with an actual window and a table that hadn't been designed to intimidate anyone, and cried before Reyna had even asked her a single question. "I need you to know something," Reyna said, sitting across from her, voice carefully stripped of every hard edge she'd used on the young hostile network guard 3 days earlier. "You're not sitting in this chair because we think you're a traitor. You're sitting in this chair because we think somebody hurt you badly enough that you stopped seeing any other door. I need you to help me understand which door that was, and I promise you, nothing you tell me leaves this room unless it has to." Okonkwo Faro's hands were shaking around a cup of water. Nobody had asked her to drink. "There's a man, he never gave a name. He found me, I don't even know how he found me. He just knew things. About Malik, about the transplant list, about numbers I hadn't told anyone, not even my husband. because I didn't want him to know exactly how bad it had gotten under the surface of everything we were pretending was fine. What did he ask you for? Nothing at first. Her voice cracked down the middle. That's the thing. He didn't ask for anything for 2 whole months. He just helped. Paid down a bill here. Covered a copay there. Always exactly when we needed it most, like he'd been watching the calendar closer than I had. I told myself it was a charity, a veterans fund, something official with a name I'd forgotten. I told myself so many things, Commander, because it was easier than asking the question I already knew I didn't want the answer to. She wiped her face, hard angry at her own tears in the specific way people were angry at themselves for crying in front of a stranger with a rank. And then he asked one question, just one, out of nowhere, about satellite pass timing on a compound I'd never even heard of before that morning. And I told him, because by then I owed him more than I could ever pay back honestly, and because Malik needed a procedure that same month that cost more than my entire salary put together. Reyna sat with that for a long moment, letting it settle into the room the way heavy things settled, because she understood, in a way that genuinely frightened her, exactly how a person built out of nothing but good intentions could end up handing a monster the keys to a compound full of American operators. Because grief made people do things certainty never would have allowed, not in 1,000 years. Because Cain, whatever else he'd become across 18 years of turning himself into a weapon, had learned to read exactly the kind of desperation that opened doors nobody in their right mind wanted opened. Did he ever tell you his name? No. But she hesitated, her eyes going somewhere distant, somewhere she clearly hadn't wanted to revisit. He mentioned a woman once. Said if I ever wanted to understand what he was actually doing, I should ask about a commander named Voss. Said she'd understand better than anyone else alive. Said that 2 of them had something in common that neither one of them had ever asked for, and that someday it would all make sense, whether I was still around to see it or not. The room went very still, because there it was. Confirmation, from an entirely unlikely source, of exactly what Reyna had already begun to suspect in the small hours of 3 sleepless nights, lying awake with a photograph she'd carried for 18 years and never once fully understood. He wasn't hiding from her. He was waiting, patient as weather, for her to finally come find him. The trail Cain left behind deliberately, she now understood, patiently, the way a man laid breadcrumbs for someone he genuinely wanted to arrive at the end of them, led them 4 days later to a decommissioned munitions facility 80 miles from the coast, abandoned by the government decades earlier, and slowly swallowed since then by scrub pine and neglect, and whatever else the years had allowed to grow up through its cracked concrete. Reyna stood at the edge of the tree line at midnight, Kestrel's small strike element arrayed in the dark behind her, and looked at a compound that had none of the improvised ugliness of Holloway Ridge. This one was different. Built with care, built, she understood, with a chill that had nothing at all to do with the night air pressing against her collar, by someone who'd once loved this kind of work enough to still take a strange, private pride in doing it properly, even now, even twisted so far past recognition that his younger self would never have understood what he'd become. Talk to me, Ashford said, low, at her shoulder, his voice pitched for her ears alone. What's the play, Commander? The play is I go in alone. No, Master Chief. No, Commander. His voice didn't rise, but something in it went hard, in a way she hadn't heard from him since the conference room 3 days and an entire lifetime ago. I don't care what history you've got with this man. I don't care whose daughter you are, or what that name is going to cost you the second you walk through that door. You walk into that compound alone, and there is no tactical justification on this earth that gets me to sign off on it. Not one. This isn't about tactics. No, he agreed. Quieter now, softer, the hardness folding back down into something closer to plea. It's about you needing to look him in the eye without anybody standing close enough to see your face do whatever it's about to do when you finally get there. I get that, Commander. I do. But I've spent 3 days watching. You find that gap between heartbeats every single time this got hard. Every single time somebody handed you something no person should have to carry alone. And I am telling you, as the man who's going to be standing 40 yards behind you with a rifle whether you like the idea or not, you don't have to do this part by yourself. You've done every other part of your life alone. This one, you don't have to. Reyna looked at him for a long moment in the dark, the tree line pressing close around both of them, the compound sitting patient and lit and waiting somewhere beyond it, and something in her chest, the thing that had been slowly, carefully unlatching itself, for 3 days now, ever since a man who'd called her uniform a rag, had shown up at her office door with 2 cups of coffee and a quiet, unshakable kind of loyalty that had asked for nothing in return came fully, finally, open. 40 yards, she said. Not one it's closer unless I call for you. I mean that, Master Chief. 40 yards, Ashford agreed. You have my word on it, whatever that's worth to you. It's worth quite a lot, actually. She said it quietly, almost surprised by her own honesty. More than I expected it to, 3 days ago. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Something passed between them in the dark that neither one of them had the language for yet, and probably wouldn't for a while longer, and that was fine. Some things didn't need language right away. Some things just needed time to sit and become true. She walked into the compound alone, exactly as planned, exactly as she'd insisted on, despite every objection, her radio silent, her weapon holstered but not drawn, because a woman walking in with a rifle raised was a threat, and a threat got answered with violence before either side had a single chance to say anything that actually mattered. The main structure was lit from within, warm light spilling through a doorway that had been left open, waiting, because of course it had been left open, because Kane had built this entire trail, this entire compound, this entire 18-year silence, for exactly this moment, and he wasn't about to let a locked door get in the way of it now, not after everything it had taken to bring her here. She stepped inside. The room was spare, almost monastic in its restraint, a single table, 2 chairs both empty, and on the wall behind them, mounted with the careful reverence of a shrine somebody had tended for years, without ever once letting anyone else see it, a collection of photographs that made her breath catch somewhere in her throat before she'd even fully processed what she was looking at. Her father, younger in every single photograph, laughing in some, serious in others, an entire life she'd never gotten to see, preserved here, in a decommissioned munitions facility, by a man who'd apparently spent 18 years unable to let a single frame of it go. He talked about you every single day. The voice came from the shadowed corner of the room, and she turned to find a man she'd never met, and somehow already knew, completely older than the photograph she carried in her duty bag, silver threading through what had once been dark hair, but unmistakably the same reckless grin, frozen now into something harder, something worn down and hollowed out by nearly 2 decades of carrying a grief that had never once been allowed to finish grieving properly. Kane, Commander Voss. He said her rank like it amused him, like it was a costume he found both absurd and, somewhere, underneath the amusement, genuinely moving. You look like him. God help you, you really do. Same stillness. I'd know it anywhere, in any room, after any amount of time. You built a compound. You armed a network. You put my father's mark on a support beam so I'd find it eventually. Her voice stayed level, though everything underneath it was anything but level. Why, after all this time? Why now, and why like this? Because somebody needed to finally answer for what happened to him. Kane stepped into the light, and she saw now the full weight of what 18 years had done to him, not just age, but something worse. Something hollowed out and rebuilt around a single, unbearable fact that had apparently never once loosened its grip. And I spent a long time trying to make that somebody answer through channels that were supposed to actually work. Reports, inquiries, every legal door available to a man who'd been quietly discharged for asking too many uncomfortable questions about a mission that got his best friend killed for nothing at all, for nothing. Her voice cracked, finally, 18 years of discipline giving way all at once, all together, like a dam that had held far longer than anyone had a right to expect. You think it was for nothing? I think Marcus Whitfield made a calculation in a briefing room and decided your father's life was worth less than a window of opportunity that turned out, Commander, to be based on intelligence that was already 12 hours stale by the time the operation actually executed. I think they got him killed, chasing a threat that had already moved somewhere else entirely. And I think everyone who made that decision got to go home to their families. That same night, while I watched my best friend disappear into a story nobody was ever allowed to tell, not even his own wife, not even his own daughter. The room went silent, except for the sound of Reyna's own breathing, ragged now, no 4-count discipline left in it at all, none whatsoever. "He's alive," she said. Not a question, a demand raw and desperate in a way she'd never once let herself sound before, not in 18 years. "Isn't he? That's what all of this has been. That's what the mark on the beam meant. Tell me he's alive, Kane. Please." Kane's face hard, weathered, carrying 18 years of a grief that had curdled slowly into something monstrous, cracked open, just slightly, into something that looked, for one terrible second, almost like pity, almost like mercy he hadn't meant to feel toward her. "No," he said quietly. "He's not alive, Commander. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you came here hoping to hear, and I know that's not a small thing to hear from a stranger in a room like this one." Something in Reyna's chest collapsed inward, slow and total. 18 years of a small, stubborn, secret hope, finally extinguished in a room full of photographs of a man who would never walk through another doorway again as long as she lived. Then why, she managed, barely, the words scraping their way out. "Why the mark? Why any of this, all of it, everything you built? Because I needed his daughter to come find me." Kane's voice had gone quiet, almost gentle, the voice of a man who'd rehearsed this exact confession 10,000 times across 18 years of solitude, alone with nothing but photographs and grief for company. "Because I couldn't make Whitfield answer for it through any door that was actually open to me anymore. But I could make him answer for it through you. I could build something loud enough and dangerous enough that eventually the daughter of Elias Voss would be sent to stop it. And when she got here, when you got here, I knew you'd finally ask the question nobody, with the actual authority to answer it, had ever once been forced to answer honestly. You used innocent people," Reyna said, voice shaking now, grief and fury braiding together into something she barely recognized in her own throat. "You used a woman with a sick child, Kane. You got American operators shot at in a firefight that never should have happened. You built an entire war out of your own grief, and you're standing here telling me it was all just to force one old man into an uncomfortable conversation he should have had years ago. I'm telling you, it was never about the network itself," Kane said, and something in his exhausted face flickered, some old shame surfacing that he clearly hadn't expected to feel this strongly, not after all this time. "The network was a means to an end. A loud enough one that somebody in that building would finally have to look at what they did to him, and to me, and to you. I never meant for anyone to actually die in that crossfire, Commander. I calculated the risk. I calculated it wrong. More than once, more than I can stand to think about most nights. That's a weight I'll carry, same as I've carried everything else for 18 years, and I'll carry it whether you walk out of here or not." Reyna's hand had drifted, without her full permission, toward her holster, her body moving somewhere ahead of the rest of her. Kane saw it, didn't flinch. If anything, something in his exhausted, hollowed-out face looked almost relieved, like a man who'd been waiting 18 years for someone to finally end the thing he could no longer bear carrying alone, night after night, in this quiet room full of photographs. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "If that's what you came here for, I won't fight you on it, Commander. I stopped being afraid of dying a long time ago, somewhere around year 3, if you want an honest answer, and I've owed you an honest answer for 18 years, so you might as well have this one too." Her hand stopped, hovering, trembling, just slightly, in a way 18 years of training had never once allowed it to tremble before. Not on a range, not in a firefight, not anywhere. Because this was the moment, the one the entire mission, the entire 18 years, had been quietly, patiently building toward, without her ever fully understanding it until this exact second. And she understood. Standing in that room full of photographs of her father, she'd never get to ask a single question, that whatever she chose, in the next 10 seconds, would define every single year that came after it, for both of them. My father taught me something on a lake when I was 11 years old, she said, and her voice, though it shook, did not break. He told me the only trick that ever mattered was finding the stillness before people who love you start yelling for you to hurry up. She lowered her hand, slow, deliberate. You loved him. However badly you've twisted that love into something monstrous over 18 years of carrying it alone, you loved him, Kane. And I think some part of him, wherever he is, would want me to find the stillness right now, instead of the trigger. I think that's the only thing he'd actually want from either one of us. Kane's face crumpled. All at once, 18 years of held-together grief finally breaking apart in front of her, a wall giving way after far too long holding back far too much. I'm not going to kill you, Reyna said. I'm going to arrest you. And then I'm going to make absolutely certain every single person who let this happen, including the general, who's spent 18 years too afraid to have an honest conversation with me about any of it, finally has to answer for it. In the open, where none of it can be classified away ever again. The extraction went quiet. No shots fired. No further casualties. No last desperate stand from a man who had apparently already spent everything he had left to spend. Kane came out of the munitions facility with his hands zip-tied, walking beside Reyna in a silence that carried more weight than any gunfight could have, while Ashford's element secured the perimeter and radioed a status report that would become, in time, the strangest after-action summary anyone in that building had ever filed and quietly closed. Hostile network leadership apprehended without incident. Voluntary surrender. Nobody in the entire chain of command would ever fully understand what those last two words had actually cost either one of them to earn. Ashford fell into step beside her as they crossed the tree line. 40 yards closed down to nothing at all now, and he didn't ask her anything. Didn't need to. He just walked. Close enough that she could feel him there. Close enough that the 11-year-old girl behind her ribs finally, quietly, let herself exhale. 3 weeks later, in a room considerably less private than any interrogation cell, General Marcus Whitfield stood before a closed congressional oversight panel and did something he had spent 18 years carefully avoiding. He told the truth, all of it, the 2008 operation. The decision made in a room full of men who'd all gone home to their own families that same night. The classified cover story handed to a grieving widow because it was the closest thing to true anyone had ever been authorized to say to her. The 18 years of silence that had followed, silence that had, without anyone fully intending it, handed a grieving man named Silas Kane exactly the kind of darkness he needed to build an entire army out of his own unaddressed grief. Reyna sat in the gallery, in her kestrel uniform, the same dark fabric that a room full of men had once called a rag, and watched a 4-star general dismantle 18 years of his own careful architecture in front of people who finally had the authority to hold him accountable for every piece of it. When it was over, he found her in the hallway outside, moving slower than she'd ever seen him move, like something had finally been set down after being carried far too long. I owe you an apology that's 18 years too late, he said. I know it doesn't fix any of it. I know that better than anyone. No, Reyna agreed. It doesn't. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her chest, the thing that had been carrying 18 years of a locked drawer, a doorway that changed shape, a story that never quite fit, no matter how many times she'd tried to make it fit finally allowed itself to soften, just a little, just enough. But it's a start, General. And starts are really the only thing any of us ever actually get to control in the end. My father taught me that too, in his own way, without ever quite saying it out loud. The lake house looked exactly the way she remembered it. Gravel giving way to dirt, dirt giving way to a shoreline that belonged to nobody official, just to the Voss family and the Herons, and whatever weather happened to come down off the ridge that particular week, the same as it always had. Reyna stood at the water's edge, with a folded flag in her hands, not the one from 18 years ago, but a new one, awarded posthumously finally, honestly, for a mission that had cost her father his life, in service of something that had actually mattered, instead of a story built carefully to hide an uncomfortable decision from a grieving family. Ashford stood a respectful distance behind her, close enough to be present, far enough to give her the silence she needed to finish something that had been 18 years in the making. "He'd be proud of you," Ashford said quietly. Once she'd finished the small, private ceremony that belonged to nobody but the two of them, and a father who'd never gotten the chance to see who his daughter became. "I only knew him through 18 years of second-hand grief and a handful of photographs on a wall in an abandoned building. But I know that much, Commander. I'd stake anything on it." Reyna looked out at the water, gray and quiet. The same water her father had once taught her to find the gap between heartbeats beside. All those years ago, when the world had still felt small enough to hold in two hands. He used to say, "Nobody invents this stuff twice," she said. "That the people who find that stillness always end up teaching it to somebody else, whether they mean to or not." I never understood what he meant by that until about 3 weeks ago. "Did he ever say who you were supposed to teach it to?" She turned to look at Ashford Master Chief Dane Ashford, who had called her uniform a rag on the worst morning of a very long week, and had spent every single day since then, proving quietly, patiently, without ever once demanding credit for it, that some men could actually learn to see past their own first impressions and become something better on the other side of that lesson. "No," she said, "but I think I finally know." The fog rolled in off the water, same as it always had, same as it probably always would for as long as this lake existed, and for the first time in 18 years, Reyna Voss stood at the edge of it and didn't feel the need to look back at anything behind her at all.